So we're making progress, but of course, for example, the styling still isn't where it should be. But we'll take care about this later, because I think the more important thing right now is to make sure that we're not limited to those dummy expenses which we created here. It's good to have them to create that list and these list items, but of course, ultimately, the goal is that users can add their own expenses. That is what this app will be all about. And if you recall the final version of the app, you might also remember that there we had this toolbar at the top, this app bar, this plus button at the top here, which we could tap to bring up that modal overlay that allows us to enter new expenses, to insert new expense data. So of course we have to work on that modal overlay, but first of all we have to add this toolbar at the top. Now for that, in the expenses start file, in this column where we want to have the chart and then also this list of expenses, we could of course add this toolbar with the add button here and try to use a row widget, for example. We could do that, but having such a toolbar at the top is such a common requirement and is often needed for so many different things. For example, also to output a title, that Flutter actually has a more official support for that and does not force us to build our own here instead of this column. Instead, this scaffold widget is not just there to give us this white background and some basic styling, but besides doing that, it also supports multiple other arguments besides the body parameter, which we set to the main page body. It, for example, also has this AppBar parameter. It also has other parameters, which we'll see later in the course, for example, drawer for adding a side drawer, but as mentioned, we'll see that later in the course in another course section. But here it's the AppBar parameter which we want to set, because AppBar can be used to add such a bar at the top of the screen. AppBar wants a preferred size widget, which simply means that it only takes certain kinds of widgets, and typically you use the AppBar widget here, which is another widget built into Flutter. Now the AppBar widget then takes a couple of configuration parameters, as you see, and as always, feel free to browse through them, but most importantly for us here, it offers an actions parameter which we can set. And actions wants a list of widgets. And this is typically used to display buttons in this top app bar, in this toolbar at the top of the screen. Now here you could add a text button or an elevated button or any other kind of button you already saw in this course, but here I'll use the icon button instead, which is another built-in type of button, another built-in widget you can use in Flutter to display a button that only contains an icon. So not text and icon, but just an icon. For that, icon button needs the icon named parameter to be set, and it should be set to a widget, but of course here typically you use the built-in icon widget. And here I'll use the built-in add icon widget like this. Now this icon widget is actually const, so we can add const here, but that's not all we have to set. Instead, since it's a button, we should also set on pressed here. And on pressed, just as on the text button, which we already saw before in the course, wants a function as a value, an anonymous function or a function defined before in your class. Here I'll, for the moment, set it to an empty anonymous function. Now with that, if you save this, you have this app bar here at the top, which might look like this, or which might look like this. It simply depends on whether you're using the Material 2 or 3 look, and at the point of time I'm recording this, Material 2 was still the default, though no worries, I built the entire course with Material 3 in mind. But if you still had that other look with that blue bar, you can go to your main Dart file and simply add this line to your material app constructor function and set the theme parameter to theme data, and there set use material 3 to true. And I'll get back to theming later in this section, but you can do this now already to get this more modern app bar look here. Either way, you have this plus button here, this icon button, which we just added, of course. What you can also see is that now that the app bar was added, Flutter made sure that all the content, including the app bar, fits better into this screen. It basically automatically reserves the space needed for the camera and so on to not be occupied by widgets, and instead make sure that your widgets, like the app bar or this chart widget or this list widget, all go below this space up here, which it reserves for these device inputs and so on. So we get all of that just by adding AppBar. And as mentioned, actions are important, but not the only thing you can set on AppBar. Instead, there are many other parameters as well that can be set. For example, you could change the background color, but again, I will come back to styling and theming later in this section. But you can, for example, also set a title here, which again is a widget, typically a text widget. And here we could set this to Flutter Expense Tracker and turn this into a constant widget like this. So with that added here, we also have this title here. And that's how you can add such an app bar. Again, we'll take care of styling later. As a next step, I instead want to make sure that pressing this plus button actually does something and that it opens this modal overlay, which then allows us to add new expenses.